It is wonderful to be here in Darwin for the first time, but back in Australia for the third time. So it feels a real privilege to be here and to have a chance to engage. Sue and I have many conversations about my being mostly outside the university, and Harry and I always believe that those in have all the resources and all the supports, and she reminds me that that isn't quite the case, and that outside we have all sorts of freedom that allows us. So I have had the privilege to focus on one approach, one issue, really, or a very complex and many-layered and many-headed issue ever since I did my doctoral thesis in the 80s. And there have been many research studies since as I found my way in. So I want to welcome all of you, and really I'm working very hard to keep my talk brief, which of course will have me not saying half the things I wished I said, but I so want to be able to hear from all of you. So I hope you will, as I talk, think about any questions. Feel free to leap in with questions, but also to hang on to ones so that we can really engage at the end. It's not the ideal setting for engaging, but I hope we can make it work or retreat when we want to. So I will dive right in. Yes? It is already happening. What I do have to remember is moving your slides along and my slides along. We have a version of technology here. So first I do just want to say that I called it Bad, Wrong, Stupid, Don't Belong. I don't want to slide right over that, but because I have really come to see that that's the internal dialogue that really regularly happens, some version of it. I used to, with a friend, regularly just call it the bad, wrong, stupid, don't belongs, so we could sort of hold it all in one go. But that version of some inner dialogue is so often what comes out of tough experiences of any form of violence, of the way that they get incorporated into our system, traumatic responses, and not only violence, but of course all the life crises that can be major, that don't require somebody mistreating others. But it does seem to me we have just a myriad of ways that we put down and diminish each other, and they happen in huge and destructive ways and tiny and insidious ways. And they all, one of the things I'm always struck by is they all come together in our bodies. And our bodies, as one beautiful researcher has said, our bodies keep the score. And so it's really important to me that we acknowledge them all, the systemic layers and the ones that seem more individual are all intertwined. So I moved from calling my work Too Scared to Learn, which was the title of one book I put out after a long research study, because I realized there is an enormous amount of learning in all of the violences that we all experience. There is so much. So even though many people did say to me, oh, that spoke to my reality, feeling too scared to learn, I realized that in that I was disappearing from view so many learnings we may not wish to have, learnings that may tell us that we are bad, wrong, stupid, don't belong, that something is all we are good for, and all those insidious and unpleasant messages. So I've gone to this as a title, knowing that that is an internal voice, and also knowing that so often, even when we've been through large and dramatic violences, we say, oh, well, that doesn't really count as violence, but what those people went through, or over there in some other place. And I have been fascinated by finding how layered that is and how problematic that is, because that takes us away from the real namings of our treatments and our mistreatments and divide us up. I think it is a human tendency that we want to say, oh, not me, over there. And yet, in that way, of course, we divide ourselves. So I want to recognize that. as we start, we just have to take a second to breathe. Many of you have rushed here from other places. You've probably carved out this little space when a part of your brain is saying, oh, I hope it's useful, because otherwise I could have just got this done, or that done, or the other done. And so I want to invite you. You are here, you are in this room, to bring your whole self into this room, to take a breath or two. And in that way, you'll support me to be fully here, and you'll get the best of me rather than just my head. And I want to invite you to bring your whole self. So let's take a big, deep breath in together. And we might just let it out. But next time, let's make a bit of sound as we let it out. So, we might let out some of the frustrations already in the day, some of the things that just got in the way. And then let's take one more and just see how foolish and silly we can make in the sound we let out. And that may bring a smile to our faces. Oh, I didn't hear a whole lot of noise. I only heard mine. I want a little bit more sound. Let's go. Awesome. Thank you for bearing with me. And maybe just a little bit of stress left your body in that process. There is nothing like smiling for changing what's stored in our brain and how we're engaging with the stresses of our lives. Sometimes I would spend if we had loads of time together, I might spend lots of time with us really letting our roots go down and our power connect upwards. But as well as learning from research, many, many layers of research over the more than 30 years I've been working in this field, especially some wonderful research where I've worked with practitioners in many different settings, educators in school settings or adult literacy settings or corrections or back to work programs or community centers. My favorite research is when we try something and see how it works and look at it closely. But I also want to say, as well as research, I feel I really learn from land and from what it is to connect to it. And so, of course, I too want to acknowledge that I'm a settler in Canada and part of some really horrendous history in Canada. And I'm a guest here on your land. And, of course, to acknowledge the Larrakia, the traditional caretakers, as Sue has so beautifully done, and anyone who is Indigenous here in this land. I have learnt much from Indigenous folks, First Nations folks in my chosen country, and it is very much my chosen land that has spoken to me and soothed much of the hurt from my own land of origin. I want to take us on to, I have a little muddle of things at the front here, and I'm going to sort of pass them as a heap and invite you to grab one or two pipe cleaners or grab a little piece of modeling clay or even take the modeling clay that's in that little case if they speak to you. Many of you already know that fiddles can keep your brain. Everyone's going to pass that one on, unable to take it. But sit with yourself for a moment. Maybe it will speak to you and it belongs to you. So don't be caught in that there's only one, so I can't have it. Maybe it's yours. So let it speak to you. I'd hoped I would have enough time to go for a little walk around and find some local rocks. I have co-led with a woman who connects to land and the wisdom of the trees and the water and the earth in a way that I dream of, maybe in a next life. But she brings even huge rocks into the room and encourages people to take their shoes off and put their feet on those rocks, or to pick up smaller rocks, but not so small, and put them on their lap or pop them in the pocket. And so even though I haven't managed to take it on here, my acknowledgement to that learning is that for many people that will soothe and settle more than my person-made fiddles that I have there, but they are a little smaller and lighter. So it's an invitation to explore, to notice. I always say that the most brilliant learning that any of us do in hard times is to take our mind away from our body when our body is left sitting somewhere we would rather not have to leave it. That is brilliant, brilliant learning. It can get in the way when we want to stay present now because we've learnt that so well. Hence the invitation to have those fiddles. And of course, in anything I invite you to here, it is the invitation to think about how it might work in your setting or how you would translate it better in your own setting. Because obviously my pieces are the pieces from away, and sometimes from away it gives us a different angle, but it's never the right thing. It's the thing that sparks the right thing in your setting. So you also, most of you have at your feet some handmade inspirational cards, a few of them bought versions, but many made in different projects. And some of you I know already know that having some sort of inspiration can just soothe us a hair, can just remind us to feel something, not that closed down, and so on. So I hope we're all in the room now. I'm going to just speak for a moment about, I'm going to speak for a very short moment about myself, and I'm going to invite a very quick round of yourselves, a name and one word to put yourselves in the room. So I, as a kid, was always trying to disappear, but I am now an educator and researcher. I grew up shaped by the influences of a father who was in the Air Force, a mother who lived through the Blitz, and all of the family dysfunctions that can come out of difficult circumstances. And it was only working with First Nations people in my country who were saying to each other in fury, of course we're all residential school survivors, even those who had not been through residential school themselves, that it dawned on me that I was shaped by war, even though I hadn't lived it. And so that reality of what shapes us. So I invite you to just pause for a second and think about what shapes you and what professionally, personally, the conditions, and so on. But I'm not going to ask you to share that. I'm just going to ask you to pause for a second and think about it. I'm going to ask you to think too about the people you support and what shapes them, and notice both the commonalities and the differences. So often I think we run away from our own vulnerabilities into busy thinking about them and what they need. But I want us to to focus entirely around our commonalities as well as those differences, recognizing that there is no them that have experienced trauma and some version of us that have not, because we all live in a violent world. We all live with the history of the violences done by settlers, certainly in your country and in my chosen country, quite apart from so many parts of the world. And I was taught by an Indigenous elder, a pipe carrier, a wise woman, in a cafe with a napkin, to remember that the damage is not in individual beings, it is in the society. When Western society privilege is only mine, here we are in a university, that privilege is mine most of the time. We think about body in Western societies to get fit and get healthy and do those sorts of things. But an emotion and spirit we put across to the side in different ways. And we lose balance. This is an off-balance wheel, and in an off-balance wheel, we're an off-balanced world. And that is an important thing to know, that we're working within and not get caught in thinking the damage is only in an individual who lives in that unbalanced world. We are all damaged in some way, and we are also all enriched in different ways. So, as we move into the four things I want to talk about in a very short amount of time, I do want to just ask you to put your name in the room we've got time for that, because I'll cut into it. We'll come back to that at the end, but I think you need to put your names in the room en masse, because I do want to quite make sure it's fully here. And when we name ourselves fully and correctly and not in a way that others often misname us, then it can help bring us here. So we're going to all say our names at the same moment. And then we will come back to say them individually at the end, those of you who can stay on longer. Because I know some of you are going to have to slide out whenever you need to slide out to go on to more content. So I hope you will stay in touch if you slide out. I've got some cards at the front and some information. So let's just put our names in the room together. So I'm going to count to three, and on three, say your name in whatever version you want to own. 1, 2, 3, 4. One more time. 1, 2, 3, 4. Awesome. I'm sad not to hear them individually yet, but I will hold my impatience around that and my curiosity around that. Because curiosity is one of the cores for me in the approach to thinking about how violence impacts learning, and not getting caught into some expert fix-it version of I know what trauma is and what it looks like. Curiosity allows us to change our point of view. And it allows, when we change our point of view, everything changes. So I want them to invite us to let go of all the diagnosis, the disability, the disorder. There's a random list of words there, some of them more medicalizing ones, some of them more learning disability-related ones, some all those judgments we offer each other and ourselves, like shy or quiet or the troublemaker or whatever. And one of the things I say all of those sort of behaviors are kids not feeling safe, adults not feeling safe too. It's more obvious with kids. It's so in our faces sometimes as kids misbehave, but we all misbehave in our own ways when it's not actually misbehaving. What it is behaving as the conditions call out of us. And those conditions can call us back into our past very sharply and easily. And this is a kid's book that I love. I often teach in great length with this kid's book, because it is a dragon, and the mother says, there is no such thing as a dragon. And the dragon gets bigger and bigger as you see eventually the dragon runs away with the house. And I would say, as long as we keep saying there is no such thing as the ways that violence impacts learning in every single setting and every aspect of our lives, they do just have to get bigger and bigger and will run away on us. And so if we turn with curiosity instead of thinking we know, then to ourselves as well as each other, then perhaps they don't have to grow so large and we can engage with the smaller versions. And for me, what's absolutely at the core of what I feel I've learned over all these years of researching and exploring is that continuation of exploration, of that sense of never thinking we know the answer, even for ourselves, but definitely not for others, about what will make a difference. And when we support exploration and we get to collaborate and travel with, then we get a whole different way of working as equals across our differences, with all the ways in which we can be an ally and offer things that might work and might help, but that aren't about fixing something broken. Because when we focus on fixing something broken, it is never as good as before it was broken. But when we look at opening up to something different, then magic happens. So that tells us that where we have to go is to connection. And that's my second focus, is how do we really grow deep, deep connection? And again, how easily Unfortunately, the conditions of most of our work interrupts true connection over and over again. It requires things immediately. It puts one of us in a position of the knower and the other in the position of not knower. And so we're always working at how we connect. And the insidiousness of all experiences of violence is they disconnect us from ourselves. And if we're not connected to ourselves, we can't fully connect to our others. They also leave us so often feeling on the outside, even if it's only an internal voice and nobody else can see that. There is that way in which from the outside we're teetering on the edge, finding our way in. I probably don't need to say it to many of you. I don't know how familiar all of you are here with all of the neuroscience about how the brain and body responds, but the piece that I find helpful to pay attention to is that it can make it very hard to connect. I see in the translation between my version of the slides and PowerPoint, I lost just a little bit of a word. Relentless violence, trauma, neglect can make it hard to connect to self when we haven't been soothed as a little, and I see lots of nodding, lots of people know the neuroscience to know that piece about how we need to be soothed as from infancy on by others who are grounded and connected. So when our caregivers are not grounded and connected to themselves and able to soothe themselves, they can't soothe us. In neglect, we are lost. We know too from the neuroscience, and I see it over and over again in my more classroom-based research, how much left and right brain are not well connected. The insula between the two, the pathway between the two is not strong. And I've seen miracles happen when we do lots of work about connecting right and left brain and play with movement and so on. So we are not connected to parts of ourselves, especially if we're in fight, flight, or freeze mode. Many of us took, as a graduate student of mine illustrated, our severed heads to school and learnt in that setting, but are lost without our own bodies. We lose a really strong connection to ourselves and the wisdom of body, and have all of the health problems that come in consequence of not being attuned to our own bodies. Many of us aren't in the moment, so we can't connect to ourselves or each other if we're not in the moment. Our minds are full of everything before and behind, and so we need to connect there. And we need ways in, especially when words have been suspect and damaging and violent. We need so many alternative ways in. So I've been really excited by research that takes us into metaphor and music and movement and visual arts. They do, all of those different media do connect to our different parts of brain, and they also allow us to express, to make our mark, to be present, and they strengthen those connections that make learning possible. And yet too often in formal learning situations, we abandon them to, we got to move on, we've got to get stuff done, and so on. We need connection. Connection is so vital, but most of us, when we really need to be connected, we ask for it in the most difficult ways, and certainly kids, of course, when we're trying to connect with them, if you're working in school settings or any settings working with children, the message seems like don't connect. And so that connection is an endless challenge. I was saying last night that I don't really like the term resilience because I feel it so often gets used as one more criticism of the children who are failing to be resilient enough. And I argue that the thing is, the failure is those of us who are in positions where we want to connect and support, and we're not fully present to ourselves or to those others. And it is enormously challenging, an ongoing challenge, but without it, resilience doesn't grow, because it is relationship that's so vital. And yet connecting can be so tricky. You see my image is an image of cogwheels getting caught. all get caught in our old patterns and other people's old patterns, and then we get locked in, we get caught in these places that, and so often our professional discourses get us caught in something that then it's so hard to find our human connection. It's like a machine connection instead of a fully human connection. But connection is vital. We need others to travel with us as we are invited to explore ourselves with tenderness, gentleness, something that is open and, again, of course, open and curious. Otherwise, we get locked. This is my favorite image from the neuroscientist, Dan Siegel, I must admit I've changed it a little. I didn't like his image of the person in the middle, so we have a blob instead. So it has no gender, no race, no class. It's just a blob, but it looks like a quite feeling blob, I think. And we all get caught on rigidity or chaos. All of the patterns that we label mental illness are some version of the chaos or the rigidity or flipping between them. But health is that we can find our way back into the flow, where we don't have full control. There's a current, but we have our paddles, our oars, we've got something to guide us through it. And I love that image because it avoids us getting into these caught, medicalizing, permanent images. They suggest that we all flow in and out of these places, and those patterns are one story that maybe more often, if we're less fixed in those stories, but they can help us, we can find ways out. I'm almost out of the time I want to speak because I so want to invite you all in, but this is a really important image for me. It came out of some research with a bunch of adult education students. Once we started talking about, it's actually really helpful to know how the brain is working, how it was brilliant in our survival mechanisms, and then how it can sometimes be less useful when we're sitting trying to learn in some setting. And so understanding what's going on for us can be helpful, but perhaps we can avoid all the medicalizing labels and can instead play with different ones. So these are some labels students put on as to what it felt like. So here's that place down the bottom, the sort of very controlled, often really closed down place, can be the freeze place. And students said, it's too quiet in my head to learn. Nobody's home, I know that. Teachers too said, I feel like there's nobody there. There's just silence. And sometimes, of course, teachers think they're the perfect student, the really good student, the one that's causing no trouble. But it can be that numbed, passive, no feeling, no energy. It's often the one that gets called not really motivated, because it doesn't look like students are engaging enough or community members are engaging, but it's that place of self-protection. Brilliant self-protection. We never want to knock it, but being able to shift out of it can be really valuable. Up at the top is the chaos, the noisy, the busy, overwhelmed, the ones that are the freeze, flight mechanisms, but they too mean we're not fully present to learn. And there's that flow in the middle. I mean, the illustration of it as a graph is one way of illustrating. There could be many others that might be more effective. But in the middle is that sweet spot for learning. And the plasticity of the brain, it works there. It doesn't work in chaosy settings. So I'm going to move quite quickly through the rest because I so want time to hear from you, hear what speaks to you, what doesn't. It's really wonderful, I've found, when we teach people about the brain. I've watched kids as young as 4 get excited at becoming amygdala tamers, as they called themselves, and got very excited. And one of the things I see when we collectively explore, we collectively support each other, and it becomes less of a lonely job to try to be with the impacts. And knowing a little bit about it doesn't have to be off into some neuroscience full of labels that is is distancing, as that work can easily do. It can be playful and creative. This was the idea of an upstairs brain and the downstairs. I realized with single-story houses in this country, that one might not be such a useful image, but I'm sure you would find ways to play with that image. Knowing more about all these things, understanding that when our vagal system is in gear, we're cautious and accessing everybody for friend or foe, those sort of things can be really liberating because they can take us away from self-blame. And I've found working with students of all ages, that bad, wrong voice is so strong, we need to move from it. And when we name things accurately, it tames them. It settles our system. When we name them in all these, judging ways, it just ups our discomfort. So naming is so important. And I'm just going to take a couple of seconds with this one. This is one of my favorite images because really, we don't talk about lettuces and say, smarten up, try a little harder, grow a little bigger. We say, the conditions obviously weren't right. For those lettuces over in the corner, the conditions weren't right. What can we do about that? How can we change the conditions? And so I could tell you so many stories, a wonderful story of a counselor, for instance, she set meetings at the end of a course, at the end of the day of the course, and none of the women, all in tough situations, showed up. And instead of saying, well, they really don't want to learn then, do they? I'm offering them this. She said, well, I'd better sit in the class and learn what's going on. And she found a way to offer them support in the class or just walking out for a moment. So when we bring that creativity, we can change conditions. And when we change conditions, the dragon doesn't have to grow so large and run away with the house. It can be tiny and we can all be engaged with it to see what's needed. And when we can see what's needed, then we will play with situations that allow. I've taught often now with a comfy chair in the corner of the room and a big quilt. I couldn't find an image of a quilt for my chair, and I've watched people retreat for a moment or two. And I thought they're going to be there for the day. And in 5 minutes, they're back. When they just had that middle ground space to calm themselves. And with kids, I've watched it in little tiny corners. Amazing. And we all need to discover what calms our senses and deactivates our nervous system and to explore and experiment whether we're those who are trying to lead others or whether we're showing others about it. That experimentation is key for the conditions because we're not learning, any of us, when our nervous system is right up. And if we learn one thing from the neuroscientists and not one single other thing, we want to learn that every brain is different and that therefore there is never one answer for everybody. We are all shaped by all of the conditions we lived, the tough ones, the nurturing ones. Really, in many ways, the good is more powerful than the bad, the good that makes meaning. And so the issue is in every situation we're trying to support others and trying to support ourselves to learn and change. Will we connect to the good or to the tough in people's lives? So I have to end with a call for you to take things on, tell you that I'm always looking for collaborators, fellow travelers, allies, to invite you to think about the small things that can make a big difference, to invite you to reflect back on what does make a difference for you, what you already do. I'm sure most of what I've said so far is really only a container for what many of you are already doing, and hopefully it's an invitation to take things a little further, sometimes even in setting. One of the things I often hear is that people are in settings where others are not supporting your instinctive and gut and wise ways of working. And so it's always that question of, can we do a little more of the things we sometimes don't dare to do because they don't fit in our settings? Can you do research that explores trying things a little differently? So there's where I want to end. Lots of resources I hope you will explore, and I have a video I call Our Brilliant Brains, and those images were all from that, drawn by Susan Tiernan. I have a learning cafe on my new site that I hope has a little survey about what courses people want. I hope you'll go there. And I will end with that slide, because that is always the reminder for me that when we move from fixing to curiosity, connection, conscious awareness, and over and over and over again trying to create the conditions that allow us all to learn and bring our full selves, the changes that happen are breathtaking, I have found, and surprising to us all.